Hello dear students, today we will discuss general features and systemic effects of inflammation. The main objectives of the topic are: first, to know about the general features of inflammation; second, to know about the types of inflammation; third, to discuss the systemic effects of inflammation; and to know the beneficial effects of inflammation. First and foremost, a brief introduction of inflammation. Inflammation, derived from the Latin word inflammatio, is part of the complex biological response of body tissues to harmful stimuli such as pathogens, damaged cells, or irritants, and is a protective response involving immune cells, blood vessels, and molecular mediators. It is the response of living vascularized tissues to harmful agents. It principally consists of vascular chains associated with leukocyte infiltration and systemic reactions. The function of inflammation is to eliminate the initial cause of cell injury, clear out necrotic cells and tissues damaged from the inflammatory process, and to initiate tissue repair. Inflammation is not a synonym for infection. Infection describes the interaction between the action of microbial invasion and the reaction of the body's inflammatory response. The two components are considered together when discussing an infection, and the word is used to imply a microbial invasive cause for the observed inflammatory reaction. Inflammation, on the other hand, describes purely the body's immunovascular response, whatever the cause may be. It's useful to differentiate inflammation and infection, as there are many pathological situations where inflammation is not driven by microbial invasion. For example, atherosclerosis, type 3 hypersensitivity, trauma, and ischemia. There are also pathological situations where microbial invasion does not result in classic inflammatory response, for example, peristalsis and eosinophilia. Now coming to general characteristics of inflammation. First, the inflammatory process is redundant and complex. This makes it a challenging subject to study. Many mediators of inflammation have same functions, and many mediators have multiple functions. Also, the same mediator may have different effects on different tissues. Second, the process is continuous over a period of time. Peracute, acute, subacute, and chronic are terms used to describe different stages of inflammation. Third, inflammation is caused by a stimulus, and removal of the stimulus should result in abatement of inflammation. If it does not get fixed in the acute period, it becomes chronic. Fourth, blood is the primary delivery system for inflammatory components. Fifth, inflammation is on a continuum with the healing process. The four principal effects of inflammation, like rubor, tumor, calor, and dolor, were described nearly 2000 years ago by the Roman scientist Aulus Cornelius Celsus, more commonly known as Celsus. Now, redness or rubor. An acutely inflamed tissue appears red due to dilation of small blood vessels within the damaged area, that's hyperemia. Now, swelling or tumor. Swelling results from edema, the accumulation of fluid in the extravascular space as part of the inflammatory fluid exudate, and to a much lesser extent from the physical mass of the inflammatory cells migrating into the area. Now, heat or calor. Increase in temperature is readily detected in the skin. It's due to increased blood flow or hyperemia through the region, resulting in vascular dilation and the delivery of warm blood to the area. Now, pain or dolor. Pain results partly from the stretching and distortion of tissues due to inflammatory edema, and in part from some of the chemical mediators of acute inflammation, especially bradykinin and some of the prostaglandins. Loss of function. Loss of function, a well-known consequence of inflammation, was added by Virchow to the list of features described in Celsus' written work. Movement of an inflamed area is inhibited by pain either consciously or by reflexes, while severe swelling may physically immobilize the affected area. Now, coming to the causes of inflammation. First, microbial infections. One of the most common causes of inflammation is microbial infection. Microbes include viruses, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and various parasites. Viruses lead to death of individual cells by intracellular multiplication and either cause the cell to stop functioning and die or cause explosion of the cell. Next, hypersensitivity reactions. A hypersensitivity reaction occurs when an altered state of immunologic responsiveness causes an inappropriate or excessive immune reaction that damages the tissues. Next, physical agents, irritants, and corrosive chemicals. Tissue damage leading to inflammation may occur through physical trauma, ultraviolet or other ionizing radiation, burns, or excessive cooling, that's frostbite. Corrosive chemicals like acids, alkalis, and oxidizing agents provoke inflammation through direct tissue damage. These chemical irritants cause tissue damage that leads directly to inflammation. Next is tissue necrosis. Death of tissues from lack of oxygen or nutrients resulting from inadequate blood flow is a potent inflammatory stimulus. Now, types of inflammation. Inflammation is of two types, acute and chronic. Acute inflammation is rapid in onset, of relatively short duration, characterized by the exudation of fluid and plasma proteins, and the immigration of leukocytes, predominantly neutrophils. The process of acute inflammation is initiated by resident immune cells already present in the involved tissue, mainly resident macrophages, dendritic cells, histiocytes, Kupffer cells, and mast cells. These cells possess surface receptors known as pattern recognition receptors, which recognize two subclasses of molecules, pathogen-associated molecular patterns and damage-associated molecular patterns. Pathogen-associated molecular patterns are compounds that are associated with various pathogens but which are distinguishable from host molecules. Damage-associated molecular patterns are compounds that are associated with host-related injury and cell damage. Now, chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is of insidious onset, of longer duration, and is associated histologically with the presence of lymphocytes, macrophages, plasma cells, proliferation of blood vessels, and fibroblasts. Chronic inflammation is considered to be inflammation of prolonged duration, rather than being just exudative. Chronic inflammation usually is productive or proliferative. Cells in the chronic inflammatory process tend to produce substances that add new tissue such as collagen fibers and new blood vessels. Many of these chains also represent the repair process, and there is a blurry continuum between chronic inflammation and the whole repair process. In general, chronic inflammation is characterized by inflammation, tissue destruction, and attempts at repair, all happening at once. Grossly, chronic inflammation does not have a much rubor or calor as in the acute reaction. Also, exudates aren't so grossly apparent as they are in acute inflammation. Because of the fibroplasias and neovascularization, areas affected by chronic inflammation tend to be slightly swollen and firm. If fibrosis is extensive, the lesions can be large and disfiguring. Fibrosis is the best indicator that the inflammatory response is chronic. In both forms, tissue necrosis of varying extent occurs. The vascular and cellular reactions of both acute and chronic inflammation are mediated by chemical substances that are derived from plasma proteins or cells. Such substances, acting singly, in combinations, or in sequence, amplify the inflammatory response and influence its evolution. The first phase of inflammation is alteration, degradation and necrosis of cells and tissues. The second phase is exudation, which includes several stages like microcirculation reaction with disturbance of blood rheology, increased vascular permeability, exudation of main blood components, immigration of blood cells, phagocytosis, development of inflammatory infiltration. According to which of the above phases prevail, inflammation may be of two types: exudative, which develops as acute inflammation, and proliferative, which develops as chronic inflammation. Now, coming to the systemic effects of inflammation. An infectious organism can escape the confines of the immediate tissue via the circulatory system or lymphatic system, where it may spread to other parts of the body. If an organism is not contained by the actions of acute inflammation, it may gain access to the lymphatic system via nearby lymph vessels. An infection of the lymph vessels is known as lymphangitis, and infection of a lymph node is known as lymphadenitis. When lymph nodes cannot destroy all pathogens, the infection spreads further. A pathogen can gain access to the bloodstream through lymphatic drainage into the circulatory system. When inflammation overwhelms the host, systemic inflammatory response syndrome is diagnosed. The effects of inflammation can be both local and systemic. The systemic effects of acute inflammation include fever, malaise, and leukocytosis. The local effects are usually clearly beneficial. For example, the destruction of invading microorganisms, but at other times they appear to serve no obvious function or may even be harmful. Fever, characterized by an elevation of body temperature, is one of the most prominent manifestations of the systemic effects. Fever is produced in response to substances called pyrogens that act by stimulating prostaglandin synthesis in the vascular and perivascular cells of the hypothalamus. Bacterial products such as exogenous pyrogens stimulate leukocytes to release cytokines such as IL-1 and TNF that increase the enzymes like cyclooxygenases that stimulate the synthesis of prostaglandins. In the hypothalamus, the prostaglandins stimulate the production of neurotransmitters such as cyclic AMP, which function to reset the temperature set point at a higher level. Drugs like aspirin reduce fever by inhibiting cyclooxygenase and thus blocking prostaglandin synthesis. An elevated body temperature has been shown to help amphibians ward off microbial infections, and it is assumed that fever does the same for mammals. Other manifestations of the acute phase response include increased heart rate and blood pressure, decreased sweating, rigors, chills, that's perception of being cold as the hypothalamus resets the body temperature, somnolence and malaise, probably secondary to the actions of cytokines on brain cells. In severe sepsis, the large amounts of bacterial products in the blood or extravascular tissue stimulate the production of several cytokines, notably TNF as well as IL-12 and IL-1. TNF can cause disseminated intravascular coagulation, metabolic disturbances including acidosis and hypotensive shock. This clinical condition is described as septic shock. Acute phase proteins are plasma proteins, mostly synthesized in the liver, whose plasma concentrations may increase several hundredfold as part of the response to inflammatory stimuli. Three of the best known examples of these proteins are C-reactive protein fibrinogen, and serum amyloid A protein. Many acute phase proteins such as CRP and SAA bind to microbial cell walls. They also bind chromatin, possibly aiding in the clearing of necrotic cell nuclei. During the acute phase response, serum amyloid A protein replaces apolipoprotein A component of high-density lipoprotein particles. This may alter the targeting of high-density lipoproteins from liver cells to macrophages, which can utilize these particles as a source of energy-producing lipids. The rise in fibrinogen causes erythrocytes to form stacks that sediment more rapidly at unit gravity than do individual erythrocytes. This is the basis for measuring the erythrocyte sedimentation rate as a simple test for the systemic inflammatory response. Leukocytosis is a common feature of inflammatory reactions, especially those induced by bacterial infection. The leukocyte count usually climbs to 15,000 or 20,000 cells per microliter, but sometimes it may reach extraordinarily high levels of 40,000 to 1 lakh cells per microliter. These extreme elevations are referred to as leukemioid reactions because they are similar to the white cell counts obtained in leukemia. The leukocytosis occurs initially because of the accelerated release of cells from the bone marrow post-mitotic reserve pool and is therefore associated with a rise in the number of more immature neutrophils in the blood. Prolonged infection also induces proliferation of precursors in the bone marrow caused by increased production of colony-stimulating factors. Thus, the bone marrow output of leukocytes is increased to compensate for the loss of these cells in the inflammatory reaction. Viral infections such as infectious mononucleosis, mumps, and German measles produce a leukocytosis by virtue of an absolute increase in the number of lymphocytes. In an additional group of disorders, which includes bronchial asthma, hay fever, and parasitic infestations, there is an absolute increase in the number of eosinophils, creating an eosinophilia. Certain infections such as typhoid fever and infections caused by viruses, rickettsia, and certain protozoa are associated with a decreased number of circulating white cells called as leukopenia. Leukopenias are also encountered in infections that overwhelm patients debilitated by disseminated cancer or tuberculosis. Most bacterial infections induce neutrophilia, that is an increase in the blood neutrophil count. In severe bacterial infections, the large amounts of bacteria in the blood stimulate the production of enormous quantities of several cytokines. As a result, circulating levels of these cytokines increase and the form of the host response changes. Cytokines cause liver injury and impaired liver function, resulting in a failure to maintain normal blood glucose levels due to the lack of glyconeogenesis from stored glycogen. Inflammation also leads to cardiac failure and loss of perfusion pressure, resulting in hemodynamic shock. Multiple organs show inflammation and intravascular thrombosis, which can produce organ failure. Tissue injury can also result from the activation of neutrophils before they exit the vasculature, thus causing damage to endothelial cells and reduced blood flow. The lungs and liver are particularly susceptible to injury by neutrophils. Lung damage in the systemic inflammatory response, commonly called the adult respiratory distress syndrome, results when neutrophil-mediated endothelial injury allows fluid to escape from the blood into the airspace. The kidney and the bowel are also injured, largely due to reduced perfusion. This condition is often fatal. Destruction of normal tissues is yet another effect of inflammation. Enzymes such as collagenases, elastases, and other proteases may degrade normal tissues, resulting in their destruction. For example, in type 3 hypersensitivity reactions and in some types of glomerulonephritis, small vessels are damaged. The swelling of acutely inflamed tissues may also be harmful. Inflammatory swelling is especially serious when it occurs in an enclosed space such as the cranial cavity. Thus, acute meningitis or an intracerebral abscess may raise intracranial pressure to the point where blood cannot move easily in the brain. There is a depression of cardiac and respiratory centers and which leads to death. Now, coming to the beneficial effects. Both the fluid and cellular exudates may have useful effects. Beneficial effects of the fluid exudate are as: first, entry of antibodies. Increased vascular permeability allows antibodies to enter the extravascular space where they may lead either to lysis of microorganisms through the participation of complement or to phagocytosis by opsonization. Antibodies are also important in neutralization of toxins. Second is fibrin formation. Fibrin formation from exuded fibrinogen may mechanically impede the movement of microorganisms, trapping them and so facilitating phagocytosis. Next is stimulation of immune response. The drainage of this fluid exudate into the lymphatics allows particulate and soluble antigens to reach the local lymph nodes where they may stimulate the immune response. With this, we come to the conclusion of our lecture. Thanks for watching.